My name's Dr Anna Machin, and as Chris said, I'm an evolutionary anthropologist, and I've studied science and anthropology of fatherhood for about 15 years now, and I've been doing it for that long, really from the birth of my first daughter. So I think we were talking earlier, most people come to fatherhood work for a very personal reason, and mine's also personal because obviously I'm not a dad. I have no experience of being a dad. But I started studying dads after the experience my husband had when we had our first daughter. It was a very traumatic birth. He pretty definitely suffered PTSD after it. He was excluded at various points and not offered any support. And because of the effect that had on him and the fact that he wasn't really seen as a true co-parent of our daughter by health and social care, when I went back to work as an evolutionary anthropologist, where my job is actually to try and understand close human relationships, including those between parents and children, I had a little bit of a look around to see what there was about dads. And there was a lot written on absent fathers and the potential harm they can do to child development in particular. But there was nothing on the vast majority of men who actually stick around and look after their children and build very profound bonds with them. So I decided that as an anthropologist, that was a major glaring oversight, that we've actually excluded that massive population in our society and don't know anything about them. So I started at the very beginning, asking some very basic questions, such as what happens to a man when he becomes a father? What's his experience like? How does he build those profound bonds, which we've all seen with his children? And does he have a role in child development? And sort of 15 years later, we are here. And what I have found with the knowledge we now have about fathers is two things. First of all, it's great at busting all those myths we have about dads, and some of those I'm going to touch on in a little while. And it's also really empowering. I think it's empowering to have this knowledge for those who work with fathers, because it's really the ammunition I think you need to go to policymakers, to go to government, to go to funding bodies and say, this is why it's important we support fathers. And it's also really empowering for fathers to know this. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go through three key myths that we've built up over time about dads, and I'm just going to give you the science as to why those myths actually are no longer true. As Chris said, really happy to take lots of questions at the end. So if you want to note them down, I'm happy to answer them then. So let's get this thing to work. One thing I just want to say before I start talking is when I talk about fathers, I'm not necessarily talking about dads who were involved in conception. So they might have a biological relationship to the child, they might be an uncle or a grandfather, but I'm actually talking about the guy who steps up and does the job. And the reason why I talk about dads in that way is, as an anthropologist, I actually have to understand fatherhood in a global perspective. And whilst in the West we have a tendency to privilege biological fathers, if you look at other societies around the world, many dads are actually social fathers. So they are not the dad who's involved in conception. They are a friend, a grandfather, an uncle, an elder sibling. Some kids have whole teams of dads. So I think when we talk about fathers, I just want to be very clear that I'm talking about the guy or guys who step up and actually do the job. So our first myth: dads are not instinctive parents, mums are. Often when I work with fathers and I work with expectant dads, one of the things they will say to me is, oh, I'm really worried about the period after the baby's born, because obviously my wife, she'll just instinctively know what to do. And I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing. And this myth, I think, has largely built up because of the physiological process of pregnancy and childbirth, and the fact that it's believed that because mums have been through this physiological process, that they somehow know instinctively what to do with a baby. So one of the first things we did when we decided to look at dads was to really explore, well, do they go under physiological changes when they become a father for the first time? As an evolutionary anthropologist, this was one of my first questions, because dads are really rare in the mammalian kingdom, investing dads. So we are one of only 5% of mammals that has investing fathers, and the only ape. And for that to have evolved, it's very unlikely that evolution left that to chance and just left dad to sort of flail around and try and work out what he's doing. It's very likely that he does undergo some form of biological and psychological change. And that's exactly the case. So 15 years later, we now know a couple of things about what happens to men when they become fathers for the first time. The first thing we know is that they go through a hormonal change, which is akin to that we see in mums. And what happens when a man becomes a father for the first time is that his testosterone drops and it never returns to pre-birth levels or pre-adoption levels, for example, as long as he remains in contact with that child. He doesn't have to live with that child, he doesn't have to co-reside, but he has to maintain some reasonably regular contact with that child. Now, we shouldn't have really been surprised about this, because this drop in testosterone occurs in all birds, reptiles, mammals, where we see dads that stick around and care for their offspring. And the reason why it has to drop is this. Testosterone, as we all know, is the male hormone, and high levels of it make you very competitive in the mating game. So men who have higher testosterone are much more successful at attracting mates and keeping them. The problem is that when you have a baby for the first time, we actually need your attention to shift from the outside world and maybe looking for the next mate on the horizon to actually focusing on your baby. And therefore, that testosterone really does have to go. And it does. Now, at the moment, we're not quite sure at what point it goes, whether it's during pregnancy, if you co-reside with the mother, or whether it's once you've started interacting with the baby. There's a longitudinal study being carried out by Lee Gettler in the States at the moment, trying to pinpoint that moment. But what we have found is that this drop occurs. It can be up to a third of your testosterone will go. And it's nothing to do with culture. It's cross-cultural. So these studies have been carried out, in Kenya, in South America, in Europe, in, Jamaica, in the Philippines, everywhere. And we see this drop occurring. So why is it important this drop happens? Obviously, you need to shift your focus onto the baby. And what we find is that men with lower testosterone tend to be more motivated to care for their baby, and they tend to get a more positive feedback from caring for that baby. So what we see with men with very high testosterone is they're not motivated to look after the baby, and they actually find some of those maybe more challenging behaviors of babies, such as screaming and that kind of thing, to be positively irritating and anger inducing, whereas men with lower testosterone are drawn to actually want to care for that baby. So that's really important in the first sense. In the second sense, high testosterone blocks two of the really key bonding chemicals that we're going to need for dad to form a bond with that baby. And those are dopamine and oxytocin. And when you lose some of that testosterone, it means that dopamine and oxytocin is more effective when it's released in your body, which means that you can build that strong bond. So what we tend to say to dads is, because some of them are a little bit freaked by the drop in testosterone, is that yes, you are going to lose some of your testosterone, but in return, you are going to get the opportunity to build the most profound and most rewarding bond with your baby. So that's the key hormonal change that men undergo. And as I've said, it's permanent unless you cease to have contact with your child. The second thing we see is actually a mirroring of what happens in women's brains when they become mums for the first time. Now, we've known for some time that mums' brains undergo quite a fundamental change when they become mums for the first time. We see increases in grey and white matter in those areas of the brain which are key in parenting skills. And in 2014, a neuroscientist called Kim and her team decided to look at this in fathers of human infants. And they looked at them between week 2, so baby was week 2, 2 weeks old, up to when baby was 6 weeks old, to see whether there was a change in brain structure during that time. And what they found was that exactly the same change in brain structure occurs in men as it does in women. So what we see, if we look at the left-hand brain image there, we see those orange and yellow bits. That's within the actual core of your brain. That's where your nurturing instincts sit, and also where your risk detection sits, both of which are really, really key for parenting. And what we see in men is we do see an increase in grey and white matter in those areas of the brain, meaning that they are more effective at prompting those skills to occur in that individual. If we look at outer, the outer levels of the brain, so you can see there on the right-hand side, that's the outer shell of the brain, the prefrontal and orbital frontal cortex. And those areas of the brain are conscious, and they are the higher cognitive abilities, such as planning, problem solving, empathizing, reciprocity, all of these things that we need to be able to deal with our baby. So, we need to be able to plan ahead, we need to be able to problem solve, we need to build an empathetic bond and have an understanding of their emotional needs. And again, in men, we see an increase in grey and white matter in those areas of the brain. So it's very much the case that men are as biologically primed to parent their children as women are. So the old mantra that women are instinctive parents and men are not, I think we can put to bed. I think anyone who's become a parent or is a grandparent has seen maybe their offspring become parents knows that There is an instinctive element in all people to parent, and then there's a massive part of it that you have to learn, and there is no difference between between mums and dads in their capability to do that. So that's our first myth busted, okay, that men are as biologically primed to parent as women. The second one is that mums attach to their babies and dads don't. Now, I'm sure I'm speaking to the converted here, but just a quick recap. Attachments are very profound, developmentally influential relationships that are built between very few people in your life. So you will have had an attachment to your carer as a child. You will have attachments to your own children if you have them. You will have attachments to your romantic partner, and you might have an attachment to maybe one or two of your friends. They are particularly key in children, as we know, because they are developmentally incredibly important, particularly in terms of brain development. When I started, even just 15 years ago, there was still very much the belief that mums attached to their babies, but the relationship a father built with their child was not an attachment. However, what we now know is that this, again, is an absolute myth. So what we have found when we've studied the relationships built between dads and children and mums and children is that they do attach to their children, but they attach in a significantly different way to mum. And this is really critical when we look at the role that dads play in child development. So if we look at the attachment that a child has with their mother, it's very much an attachment based upon nurture. And we know that. And anyone who's researched mums knows that you do the strange situation with them to assess their attachment. And that's very much about that nurturing relationship to find out whether they have a secure or an insecure attachment. When we look at dads, they also base their attachment on nurture. It's very much about creating a safe haven for that child to come back to where they are confident that they're going to. But there's an added element of challenge. And this is really, really key to the difference between mum's attachment and dad's attachment. So what I tend to say is mum's attachment is quite exclusive. And what I mean is it's very much between the dyad. It's quite inward looking. And it's kind of like the mother is clutching that child to them and protecting them against the world. With dad, we get that. But what we actually get is we get that hugging motion. But then dad will actually turn the child to the world and say, right, this is the world. And I challenge you to go into it and deal with its difficulties, its joys, its hurdles, its failures. And the thing is, I'm going to help you do that. And you must know that you've always got this secure base to come back to when you hit a challenge that maybe you can't deal with alone. And this really keys into the fact that one of the primary roles of a father in child development is to build mental and physical resilience in their child. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But this comes from the fact that this attachment is about being nurturing, but it's also about merely pushing those boundaries a little bit for that child, really maybe teaching them those resilient skills that they're going to need to thrive and survive in the world beyond the family. And we actually see this in brain activations that we see in mums and dads when they're interacting with their children. So when we're looking at that lovely brain section with the pink bit, which is very helpfully the female one, I'm not sure why they're pink and blue, but the left-hand scan there, that is a female brain. That's the brain of a mother when she is interacting with her child. And what we see is we're talking about peaks in activation here. So which is the bit of the brain which is the most active? It doesn't mean the other areas of the brain are not active, but here we've highlighted the peaks. And what we see is we see peaks in activation in the very core of the brain. And the core of the brain, the unconscious brain, is where your nurturing and risk detection skills sit. So we see that nurturing basis to the attachment relationship peak activating in mums when they look at their children. When we look at dads, we see a different peak activation, and that's the dorsal prefrontal cortex, the DPFC, which is that little blue spot there. And that's showing us that the peak in activation in dads actually occurs in the outer conscious area of the brain where your higher cognitive abilities sit. And that's related to social cognition and pushing those developmental boundaries. So it very much underlines this idea that dad's role actually is to scaffold his child's entry into the world beyond the family. It's to give him or her the skills they're going to need to survive in that particular, sometimes tough world. Now, the interesting question is, this is done in heterosexual couples, and you can see there we've got this split. The question arises, what happens when you have a single parent, or for example, you might have gay or lesbian parents? Now, one of the studies that was carried out, which is really, really interesting, was done on primary caretaking mums and primary caretaking gay fathers. So when we look at those primary caretaking mums, we see what we see there on the right-hand side of the screen there. And they were married to a male was around. But when we look at gay dads, what we see is generally there isn't a mum figure in that child's life. They might have female influences, but it's not quite the same. And what we see in the gay male fathering brain is we see peaks in activation in both areas of the brain. So we see them in the right amygdala there, which is risk detection and nurturing. And we see them in the DPFC, the dorsal prefrontal cortex. So that gay father, his brain has actually adapted to make sure that he gives that child that entire developmental environment, even though we haven't actually got a mum in the picture. And that's something we need to remember about the human parenting brain. It is unbelievably adaptable. It is so important that we raise these very dependable and very quite tough offspring to raise in a healthy developmental environment, that our brain is open to changing to make sure as much as possible that that child will have that environment. And what's really interesting in that piece of literature on gay primary caretaking fathers is they have those two peak areas of activation, and a new neural connection has developed between them so that they can communicate. What I'm not saying with this particular slide is that dads don't nurture and don't have a lovely little bit in the middle, and mums don't have that social cognitive bit on the outside. They do, it's just not the peak in activation. So this brings us together to this idea of attachment, this idea that dads have this nurturing and challenging role, and this role building resilience and scaffolding the child's entry into the world beyond the family. And how they build their attachment is also very different. Mums, it's fair to say, do have a head start if they've given birth to their child, because obviously pregnancy, childbirth, if you choose to breastfeed, are all wonderful floods of bonding neurochemicals occur in there as a byproduct of the pregnancy and the childbirth in particular process. So they do get a little bit of a head start. Dads obviously don't experience that head start, and they have to build their bond with their baby through interaction. And get those releases through interaction. Now, obviously, in the first few weeks, this can be quite tricky to achieve, particularly if mum is breastfeeding. It can be quite hard for a man to find a way in to start building those interactions. The other issue is, as we all know, is that tiny little babies don't really give you much back. So it's very much not a two-way interaction in those first weeks. And it's fair to say that what we've identified with dads is that there might be what we call a delay in bonding. And that is because of the fact that they have to do this very behavioral way of interacting with their child, of building that attachment. And it's actually something that I prepare my dads for. It was something that came up in the very first study I ever did. I had several dads who were really quite down about the fact that they seem to be struggling to form a bond with their baby, holding mum up as the golden standard of baby bonding, because she seemed to be able to do everything and calm the baby, and they weren't able to do that. And it's actually about handling those expectations. And interestingly, Turner in 1970 recognized this. He said there's a two-tier bonding process for fathers. The first at birth, if we're talking about biological children, is that very conscious genetic relatedness of, this is my baby, and I am genetically related to it, and therefore I love it and I will care for it. But give it 6 months later, and there is a much second tier bonding, which is much more profound and much more powerful. And that is based on interaction. That is based on those two people, the baby and the father, having had time to get to know each other, to actually interact with each other and to build that bond. And that is a much more profound attachment relationship. And certainly when I talk to my dads, if you talk to them about the bond they had at birth and you talk to them about the bond they then experienced at 6 months, it's profoundly different. One of the best ways, obviously, that you can build that bond as a dad, and I'm sure you all know this, is play. And particularly rough and tumble play. So play is developmentally incredibly important for a child. It's not just dad being the fun parent. We always encourage fathers, if they are comfortable, to rough and tumble play with their children, because it's for two reasons. In the West, it's a really good time efficient way of building a very powerful bond with your child, because the physicality of rough and tumble play, the laughter, the fact you're touching, the fact that it's got that little bit of risk and maybe a little bit of pain associated, leads to a massive flood of neurochemicals. So it leads to the flood of beta endorphin, dopamine, oxytocin, and serotonin. And they are all really, really key in building those strong bonds. And because it's so fast and furious, it can do that really, really quickly. So in a time poor world, particularly if dad is out at work, rough and tumble play is a really good time efficient way of building a strong bond really, really quickly. The other thing about it is developmentally, it's a really key behavior, because it has all the elements of starting to teach that child about those social relationships and about that resilience they're going to need when they go beyond the family. So if you think about play is about reciprocity. It's about understanding whether your partner is still having fun or whether you've pushed it too far, particularly with rough and tumble play. It's about trusting your partner. It's about reading them through empathy. It's also about building that resilience of dealing with the challenge of the physicality of it, of dealing with the risk of it, of dealing with maybe the failure of maybe one of your play moves not working. And if you think about rough and tumble play, we've all seen it. It's incredibly physical, incredibly exuberant, and it's usually accompanied by howls of laughter. So, it might be wrestling, throwing in the air, airplaning around the room, bouncing on each other, tickling, whatever it might be. It's really exuberant, but it's giving that absolute flood of bonding chemicals, but it's also starting to teach that child about reciprocity and social relationships and the resilience they're going to need to carry on in the world. And one of the most wonderful pieces of science we have about dads and play and babies and kids and play is that children prefer neurochemically to play with their fathers than their mothers. We always have this kind of stereotype of, kids might move towards mum, particularly if she's the primary carer, to have a hug, whereas they will move towards dad to have a good time. And it is to a certain extent true, because what we find in children, if we look at what causes a peak in oxytocin release, oxytocin obviously being a bonding and reward chemical, in mums and dads and kids when they interact with each other. For mums, the peak in oxytocin and peak in oxytocin for the child when interacting with the mum comes, with a really good cuddle, a really good nurture session. With dads, it comes with play. And therefore, dads and children have co-evolved to seek each other out for play, because that's when they're going to get that really big hit of oxytocin. So that's our second myth, hopefully shattered, that dads don't attach to their children. They do attach. They attach in a different, possibly arguably more complex way because of the challenging element, and they build that attachment in a different way. But the attachment is there. It's incredibly important to child development. So our third and final myth: dads play no independent role in child development. So again, this was a belief when I started, that as mums were generally the primary carer, they were the environment of development, and dads could really only maybe reinforce those developmental aspects, but they certainly did not have a unique role in their own right. What we've actually found is dads have a very key role in child development, particularly at two key points in a child's life. And this is related to that idea that they're going to help that child move into the world beyond the family. And it's during these two phases. It's at preschool age, when they perhaps maybe go to preschool or nursery for the first time. And it's during adolescence, when the child is slowly actually shifting their attachments from their parents to their peers, and they're slowly starting to pull away from the parents and start to build that autonomous, independent personality. And so we're getting increasing evidence that these two key times are actually the time when dad particularly has a very strong and unique and significant, often more significant role than mum does in particular aspects of child development. So if we look at the preschool age, if you think, for many children, this can be the first time they've actually maybe left the family and they actually have gone into the world beyond the family. And what they will rapidly find is the rules are different probably to home, and the tolerance that world might have to some of their behaviors is probably less than they had at home. So they're going to have to really start to understand the rules of social engagement. And we see in children that dads have a particular role in two key areas at sort of around the age of 2-3. The first is in language development, and particularly social language development. So dads seem to have a greater impact on language development and the ease with which the child builds social language development at the age of 3 than mums do. And this is linked to the degree of sensitive parenting we see between father and child. So where we see higher degrees of sensitive parenting, so obviously that's being appropriately empathetic, supporting the child, having good reciprocity with the child, not being, unhelpfully intrusive, these sorts of behaviors, holding eye contact, that kind of thing. Then we see that dads actually have this really powerful influence on development of language at the age of 3. And what's really interesting is mums only have an equal influence if they are within the higher social economic sector tier. Dads have an influence on language regardless of what social economics background they happen to have. So it really is dad who's carrying that really important role at that age. The other thing dads have a really strong role in, above and beyond that of mum, is executive function. Now, executive function is a set of skills which children need to develop to be able to operate in the social world. And they are things like working memory, so being able to extract information quickly and easily from your brain and use it appropriately. Attention, so actually holding attention to a particular task, even though something else is going on around you. And inhibitory control, and particularly inhibitory control of maybe some of the less helpful emotions. So being able to deal with your emotions, both negative and positive, in an appropriate way. And what's been replicated in many studies now is that dads seem to have a bigger role in executive function, and indeed how easily their children transition into preschool life, than mums do. And when we're trying to explore why that might be, one of the reasons that's been come up with is that dads seem to have this particular role in the stimulation of development. And again, this seems to go back to this challenging aspect of the attachment, that dads are the parent who kind of pushes the developmental boundaries a little bit, maybe. And anecdotally, that's certainly something I see in my dads. When I go around and talk to the dads, and I interview them at various points across the course of the child's life, it generally is dad who's the one, particularly, trying to get the baby to walk, trying to get the baby to sit up, trying to get the baby to, pile up the, do hand-eye coordination, whatever it might be, is the one who's really, right, okay, what's the next developmental boundary? Let's see if we can get my kid to the next developmental boundary. So dads seem to have this role because they have this role in stimulation of development in their children. When we look at teenagers, it's mental health that dads have this incredibly powerful influence on. And this is something I'm particularly keen to get out there. And I've written on in various sort of outlets to try and really get the idea that actually dads are an amazing untapped mental health task force for their teenagers. We have a problem with poor mental health in teenagers at the moment. And really, they are an untapped resource that we're not really using. And again, their role in mental health seems to be something to do with this developmental role they play in resilience and building mental resilience in their children and teaching their children to deal with challenge, to get over the hurdles in life. When they fail, to pick themselves up and sort of dust themselves off, to keep persevering. And what we find, again, replicated studies, is that dads who have secure attachments to their children, fathers who have sensitive parenting roles in their children's life, they seem to reduce the possibility of depression, loneliness, and low self-esteem in their children. And often when I sort of present this, particularly if I present this to a public audience, what I get dads afterwards saying, I've got a teenage kid. So how do I do that? How do I do that with a teenage kid? Because teenage kids tend to push you away. And what we've actually found in relation to mental health and trying to, bolster their mental health, is one of the most important thing a dad can do is make that child feel important to them and interact with that child in an appropriate way. So you don't have to do anything amazingly fancy to be that dad who's trying to sort of underpin and give this good, strong mental health foundation to your child. One of the key things is understanding the different ways in which children measure their importance to you as a parent. And this leads very strongly into self-esteem and the risk of depression. When we look at how children know they're important to their mothers, they know they're important to their mothers because they know their mum thinks about them and considers their needs and their practical and emotional needs. So a kid feels important to their mother because, for example, she knows that they're maybe going to have a difficult day at school and they might need an extra hug, or she remembers to buy them the breakfast cereal they like. For dads, it's very different. Children get self-esteem and an understanding of their importance to their dad from the fact their dad spends time with them. If the dad spends time with them, they know that they are important to that dad, and that builds their self-esteem. And the interaction they have, it doesn't have to be anything fancy. Study after study have shown it's not about doing something amazing and big, and it can be something as small. It's finding something that you share or something that has to be done that you can do together. So it might be cooking the Sunday lunch. It might be cleaning the car. It might be walking the dog. It might be going to a football match together. It's something like that, but it's time that those two people spend together doing something that they can focus on together. And it seems to be that those sorts of interactions are the ones that really build this resilience in the child, and this idea that they are important and is a preventative factor in not having poor mental health. So again, the fact is, this really powerful role that dads have in this scaffolding the child into the world beyond the family, it's all down to this very different relationship a father has with his child and this building of resilience and all those life skills they're going to need going forward. just to wrap up, one of the reasons why I do this work is I want the people who hear it, and particularly dads actually, to feel empowered by the knowledge that we now have about who they are and the role they have in their child's life. So first of all, we want them to be empowered by the idea that they are evolutionarily selected to be around because they are so incredibly important. It is absolutely the case from an evolutionary point of view that if investing human fathers had not evolved, our species would not exist. So they are incredibly important in the survival of the individual. That they are biologically primed to be dads, to be parents as much as mums are, and following on from this, that they are as instinctive at this as mum is. They are not the secondary parent, they are a true co-parent. That they are different, and that difference is fundamental to the child. Evolution doesn't like what we call redundancy. It doesn't cause two people to have exactly the same role if that's not required to reach the desired endpoint. So in this case, we don't need mum and dad to be exactly the same because the kid doesn't need that. Actually, what the kid needs is that difference so that they get that entire developmental environment. And particularly, obviously, at the core of that is that very strong difference in attachment and that very strong difference in how they input into development. They are unique. Dads are unique. They are not a male mother. They are there to do a very particular job that's really, really important. They are really diverse. We didn't have time to touch on this today. It's more anthropology than anything else, but dads around the world are so incredibly diverse, and that's because they get to be more flexible than mum. Mums are tied a little bit in their role by the huge biological process of pregnancy, childbirth, and breastfeeding. Dads can be much more flexible, and when we look around the world, it's actually dads who are the parent who can quickly respond, for example, to changes in environmental threats. And because of this, we see this amazing diversity. And sometimes I find it quite nice to talk to dads within the UK and within the West about dads from other cultures, because it shows you that you can achieve your goal of being a dad in lots of different ways. And it's about recognizing what kind of dad you want to be. And I think that's one of our roles, is helping dads do that. So really what I want this information to do is lead to change, lead to an understanding, particularly from those in power, but also people who work with parents, that we didn't know who dad was 15 years ago. We know much more about who he is now. And he is not the person we thought he was. He's somebody very, very different. And I'm hoping it will change attitudes to fathers and that it will lead to greater support and recognition of what they do. I'm sorry if that was a bit of a really, really fast run through that. Thank you for listening. Thank you for taking us aboard. Please share it with as many people as you can, because I think it's really important. If you're interested in more information about it, I did, as Chris said, write the book, 2018, The Life of Dad, The Making of the Modern Father, and all the science and much, 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 much more about who dad is in that book. And that's it. Thank you very much. I will stop sharing. There we go.
Well, thank you so much, Anna. That was a thoroughly interesting and insightful and certainly a myth-busting talk as promised. So I wondered if anybody in the room has any questions or any comments they would like to share or ask. Now, is anybody have, Dan, you've got your hand up? On you go. Oh, I think you're on mute.
That might help take myself. I should know after 18 months to take
There you go.
That was fascinating, first of all. And it really, a couple of points really stood out for me. The questions I've got. I run a non-profit called Dad La Soul. So we actively encourage dads to spend time with kids, but also challenge some of these myths you've brought up. A couple of things. You said, obviously in the early stage, there's a bonding process through, so I'm just reading some notes I took about breastfeeding, but the dad's bond comes along 6 months. The conversations I have from the grassroots is that the dads are back to work by then, right? And our primary function is the hunter-gatherer, to go out. And I had it with my own son, where I would commute and I would get home very late. And just be lucky enough to put him to bed. And then come the weekend when it's our time, didn't really know who I was. And through the conversation, that seems to be very, very common. So how do we counterbalance this? It's okay saying you've got to be active for the rough and tumble, but if society is telling us that we've got to go and earn the money, and that is, there's still the massive inequality with shared parental leave, and a lot of fellas that I know work for themselves. So that just isn't an option. How do we address that, first of all?
It's really hard. It's really hard because obviously we know this, and all of those systems, that idea that dads are there to provide, and lack of paternity leave and the shared parental leave disaster, which it's not fit for purpose by any stretch of imagination, was all built on this on a lack of understanding of who dad actually is and what dad wants, and also what his child needs in terms of building that relationship. And that's the problem. We have to change our culture fundamentally from the roots up, and it's really hard. I'm an anthropologist. I study cultural change, and it takes generations, and it will take generations. And that's why we have to get this information out there, first of all, to show that actually, yes, dads do need more time off, because this idea that you take your 2 weeks paternity leave, if you're lucky enough to get it, in those first 2 weeks. Well, why can't you take it at another time, when actually, or split it up a bit? And with the shared parental leave, obviously many men cannot take that because financially it's not supported to the extent that they can do that, and they've still got this very strong cultural expectation that they will provide. And that's a really difficult tension to deal with. So I don't have all the answers. The biggest answer is we have to lead this cultural change. And that's why those of us who lobby the government about this shared parental leave issue do it so passionately, because it's based upon the complete lack of understanding of who dad is still, and actually what he needs. So the only thing I can say is, yes, it is really, really hard. Rough and tumble play is there because it's very, very time efficient. What's really interesting is in cultures where dads don't go out to work. Let's look at real hunter gatherers.
Yes.
And they spend a lot of time in contact with their children. They don't rough and tumble play. They don't have to, because they're in contact with that child for 50-60% of the day. They might be carrying it, so they actually do it just by hugging, by singing, by telling stories. They might do a little bit of play, but they don't do rough and tumble play because they don't need to. We've got it because it has to fit into this mad culture we've got. So I'm really sorry, I don't have the answers. No. It's why we're trying to change it, because it's just not acceptable.
That's great. And then the other point that you made, or one of the other points about the importance and self-esteem being added to by spending time with the dads. We do dad and child play dates that have done for 5 years, but interesting ones, rather than being stuck in a horrible church or a week or in squash. Why is there so that? Well, they say this came about because there is nowhere for the dads to go with the kids. You're going down the park and you're on your own, or you're going to soft play and you're on the mobile phone. If this is so important for increasing the sort of the self-esteem of the child, and obviously that having huge impacts later on, why are there not more spaces and activities that are dad friendly? Why, when we try and go to mother and baby groups, are we forced out and made to feel uncomfortable?
Because people don't know this, because people don't know it, or they don't want to accept it. And that's the problem again. And that's why I spend a lot of time talking about this. I think it is going to take a generation. If you look at places where they've had proper shared parental leave for a reasonable period of time, you do see dads in those places, and you do see dad appropriate, activities carried out that dads actually want to do with their kids. But it's going to take and it's going to take absolute acceptance by society and by government of who dad actually is. We need to stop developing things which are based on no reality at all. I mean, these ideas we have about fathers are not based on the reality. We build these myths. We even have myths about, Victorian dads being cold and distant. Actually, if you read stories about Victorian dads, many of them were really lovely. But we build these stories, and I don't know why, because it's really not fair. So that's why we have to get this information out there and say, right, dads need spaces. Dads need to have that time with their children, because yes, and it's always the money with government. We go in and we say, look, if you provide spaces for dads to be with their children and to do these activities, because we know it's about doing activities with your child, then in 10, 20 years' time, you're going to have less of a mental health problem, because these kids are going to go forward and but it's about getting that message out there that dads have this amazing role in mental health.
Isn't it the balance as well? So you wait 10 years down the line for the benefits for the kids, but it also has a direct benefits on the self-esteem of the dads while they're there, because they don't feel so rubbish and crap and it's Saturday and I've got nothing to do, or actually I've just gone and made a friend and now I can phone up somebody and go swimming with them with another group of kids, rather than the very simple things that the mums are able to do. But you can't just phone up somebody else's wife and say, do you fancy hanging out?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's absolutely true. And it does, that's why I share this information, because I want dads to know that you are meant, so you are important, that you are unique, that you really do bring something very different. You're not the secondary parent. You are a co-parent, and you are an equal player in the game of being a parent right from the very beginning. And those are the messages we have to get into antenatal, areas, into postnatal areas, throughout that child's life, that this guy is a real player in this. And if you exclude him, that can only be bad for the family. It's actually really bad for society, and it's bad for the child. But it's about getting this information out there and saying, these are actual facts. You can't debate these facts. We've seen these changes happen in men. We've seen the influence that they have. And therefore, we need to use that as a foundation to say, right, but it's so hard because people are so blinkered to their ideas of who dad is. Doesn't matter how many dads you meet, that's the thing. I would read all these things about absent dads when I first started, and I think, well, these aren't the dads I know. Even the ones who are divorced, this isn't the dad I know. And it's just a myth-making exercise a lot of the time.
I think, there's two. So just to finish, there's either the absent dad or the angry separated dad that wants to dress up as Spider-Man.
Yes,
and
exactly.
Shout at people. Actually, where's this nice middle ground that the majority actually fall in? Well, massively unrepresented.
Yeah,
but anyway,
exactly.
There's plenty of questions, but that was really inspiring, and I'd love to talk to you more on it.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Dan. A couple of really important questions there, and got a couple of hands up in the room. So I think Dave from Lads to Dads, I think you had your hand up first.
Yeah, hi Anna. That was extremely informative. I mean, I have listened to your TED Talk, I don't know how many times, and I've sent your TED Talk on to so many dads that we work with, because I just think it's such a powerful, important message. So I was delighted when I heard you were on here today. So I suppose what I really wanted to talk about, we are in the early stages of development. It's a perinatal and postnatal support service for dads, really is what we're about, with a year one kind of child development piece on the side of it. We're big into attachment and bonding. And I'm very interested about the two-tier piece that you spoke about, because I would hear over and over about with some of the dads, the conversations we'd have about that they didn't bond straight away, and they felt so guilty around that, and that's okay, that's normal, it happens in difference. So I was just wondering, that two-tier piece that you're talking about, could I just erase a little bit more information on it, just so I can I want to look it up, because I think it's a hugely important piece for me.
Yeah, no, this certainly is. And I can send you, Turner's paper is really old, and it's amazing that he recognized this all those years ago. I got 50 years ago, and nobody noticed. But yeah, there's more in the book, but I can certainly send you some papers on it. It is really about handling those expectations for dad, I think, because, again, we have this sort of idea from the media and everything that your baby's going to come out and you're going to feel a flood of love. And, that doesn't happen for some mums. And it's going to be amazing. And then that doesn't happen. And then they do set this gold standard of mum. Oh, my God, she can soothe the baby. She can do all these amazing things. And I'm not doing anything. So it is very much about handling those expectations and also explaining the science behind it. I find that quite helpful. If you say, this is not something you're doing, this is something that happens. And the reason why you're not quite getting there is because your partner's had a head start. She's ahead of you, because childbirth is like a cascade of bonding hormones, often because they're there to do something entirely different. But the side effect is she is really bonded to that child by it. So I explain the science to them. And I explain ways in which they can try and get into starting to build that interaction, even when baby is developmentally very, not capable of interacting properly. So I'll say to them, if you can, like 2 things that are really good in those early weeks, if you can. Baby massage, amazing. We know that baby massage leads to a lovely flood of bonding hormones for baby and daddy. It's also one of the key interventions that has been found to help dads with their mental health. So if they're feeling a bit down, if they've got the, sort of the baby blues, as people call it, doing a baby massage, getting into that routine, maybe before bed, whatever it might be, really good for both. The other thing, obviously, is the classic bath. That leads to less of a flood for dad, because he tends to find that quite stressful. But, again, find that thing that's yours and make it yours and say, this is mine. I do this. And that's something that you can do with that baby. So even if you are a dad who maybe gets home late and maybe all you can do is put the baby to bed, maybe you can do that baby massage in those first weeks. And the other thing to say is, although it feels like a really long time, baby is actually going to start interacting with you quite quickly. So, you'll get the smile, then you'll get the babbling, you'll get the eye contact, you'll get the smile when you get home from work. And actually quite rapidly, you'll start to get that feedback, which is going to really start to build that bond. But it is really hard. And I do handle my dad's expectations about it because it's not really something we talk about.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. It's funny because we've added a baby massage, and I won't take up too much time. I'm sure there's other people who want to speak, but with the power of baby massage for me, I've only recently discovered, and it's just so important for bonding and attachment. And the last thing I want to say, and I'll stop, is that I do feel the role of dad is massively changing. And I think it's very, very encouraging to see how dad's role, if the supports and services caught up with it, I think we'd be in a much better place. But I just want to say thank you. It's been a pleasure to listen to you.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Dave. And Ian Maxwell from Shared Parent Scotland, you've got a question, I think.
Yes, thanks very much for the talk. I know your book already, and it's very useful things. At Shared Parenting Scotland, we're dealing with parents who've separated and often who are having trouble, particularly fathers, but also some mothers, in getting any time with their children, or when they go to court, making the argument for spending half the time, or their children spending half the time with them. The attitude of sheriffs in Scotland tends to be, oh, well, as long as you get every second weekend and half the holidays, that's enough for the father. We had William Fabricius from Arizona talking with us recently, and his work suggests lots of benefits for children of having two secure parents that they see half the time each. Would you agree that 50-50 care is advantageous for children after separation?
Absolutely. And it's a model we need to, a real true co-parenting model is that, yes, you have separated as romantic partners or whatever, but you have not separated as parents. And those children, we know that the evidence now for co-parenting being the best way to raise those children is very, very strong. The problem we have again, and it's about also getting this information I'm talking about into the ears of people who make these decisions, these legal people who make these decisions, because again, they are making decisions again based on very outdated understanding of how important fathers are. And it's very, there should be an absolute presumption of absolute equality and absolute co-parenting, unless there's a very, very serious reason why that cannot happen. And we should all be assisting those parents in helping that happen, because ultimately that is what is best for these children, is that they have evolved to have two investing parents because that's what they need. We wouldn't have investing fathers if we didn't need them. There's lots of mammals out there who don't have them, and it might be a very basic evolutionary argument, but it's there for a reason. Children have evolved to be brought up by this village. That's human children are amazing at, talking about attachment. They can attach to many different carers, but they have evolved to have two investing parents. And that's why the presumption should be full co-parenting.
Yeah. Well, our helpline has taken 2 calls from fathers since you started this talk. Both of them are not seeing their kids. Yeah. That's the work we try to do, and the arguments that you can. Well,
if there is any way you can get this information in front of people who make these policies, who make these legal decisions about children's lives, then please do. I'm very happy to talk to them, whatever, because we need them to understand.
Good. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ian. And in the chat box, we've got a question from Diane Cherry from Clackmannanshire Council. I don't know if you're okay to ask the question yourself, Diane?
Yeah, I was just wondering whether the benefits to children of having an involved dad in the co-parenting that you've described, whether those benefits also happen if there is no dad involvement, and if it's a granddad or an uncle or another male role model in that child's life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we have to be careful also, because dads those are what we call social fathers. And they exist in many societies around the world. And in fact, in many societies, they are the dad, they're not even called social fathers. And we have them in our, stepfathers, adoptive fathers are technically social fathers. And yes, it does not have to be the biological conception father that's involved. It's about that person being there and stepping up and doing those jobs, building that attachment, having that role in child development, doing those interactions with teenagers that they need to feel important. it's about that, and it can really be anyone, as long as that attachment is there. And that's the wonderful thing about human children, is we can adopt as a species. We are the only species that can adopt, because of the fact that children will attach to anybody really who meets their needs, their complex needs, but that's the amazing thing. So no, it absolutely, and a lot of these studies are not just done on conception fathers, particularly the mental health ones. Actually, a lot of them have been done on stepfathers. So it's about somebody stepping in and doing that role. And that can be a grandfather. And that's why we have to be a little bit careful when we say children don't have a dad in their life, because often what we mean is they don't have a biological dad in their life. But there's been a really good study done asking children who they think their dad is in their life, children of single mothers. And quite often they will pinpoint one or more people who fulfill that role for them. It's just we need to broaden our idea about who it is.
Great, thank you. Found this really inspirational, this talk today, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's opened my eyes on several fronts, actually, so I hope to then take that back into the practice that I do within the council.
Brilliant, that would be amazing. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much, Diane. There are quite a few comments in the comment section. If you have the time to take a look, quite a few dads here talking.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think the things that you've been saying, the messages and the myths that you've been busting, I think people are finding them really inspiring and affirming,
Yeah, brilliant.
Which is great to hear. And a few people are sharing examples of some of the pieces of work that they're doing within their own organisations to try and I guess do what you've asked us all to do, which is empower dads in trying to change the culture. So that's fantastic as well. I wonder if, so someone's asking if it's possible to have a copy of this chat thread. Absolutely. We'll share the chat thread with everyone. Now, I notice that our very own Kathy Sexton has her hand up. On you go, Kathy.
It was just a really quick one, actually, Anna. So we conduct dad surveys every year. And since the start of lockdown, we've conducted 3 surveys. So we conducted one during the first lockdown, one during the second lockdown, and one during October and November this year. And what we're finding is dads, it seems that dads who have been with their children, so obviously during the lockdowns, dads have come home and they've spent a lot more time hands-on with their children. And what it seems like to us is that they wanted to change the way that they parent to be more present with their children. And that trend is continuing. So it looks like dads are actually wanting to change for good. What was something that was temporary to begin with. Yeah. I'm just wondering whether you had any other anecdotal evidence or had witnessed the same sort of thing. I know that the Fatherhood Institute has done some studies during the first lockdown, but ours is quite, I suppose, we're looking at dads right now. And I'm just wondering whether you've seen anything similar, or you're aware of what other stuff that is going on.
I haven't done any actual formal study on that. Only anecdotally, I know that dads, because what they've been given is a glimpse of what life could be, I suppose, and they've really enjoyed that time and really getting to. I think someone earlier said, it's really hard for a kid and a dad to get to know each other, just before bath time or at the weekends, because they haven't got that tight bond necessarily to build it upon. And that's what it's given dads. It's given dads and kids the opportunity to really get to know who each other is and build that profound bond. And yes, there has been a trend over the years, even before lockdown, of I think it's because we're starting to get this information out a little bit and various other things, of dads starting to really challenge the status quo. It's certainly changed in the 15 years I've done it, definitely. We're now getting dads who are saying, actually, you know what, I don't want to climb up the corporate ladder. I'm perfectly happy where I'm in the middle ground, and I will, demand flexible work. But again, it's about, we know dads now really want this. It's about getting the culture changed so that we can support them in having it. And actually, one thing I will tag just on the end, just from the other point of view, is it's hugely beneficial to women as well, because one of the ways we will change the gender wage gap is by having more equality in the home, empowering dads to be more at home, and then women actually have more freedom to go back to work earlier or whatever it might be, and they have less of a career penalty of being the primary carer. So it's all good. It's just trying to get the people who hold the money and hold the policy to actually accept that.
Absolutely. I mean, it's fascinating. I do believe that there's been this huge cultural change.
No, there has. There really has. And it's hugely exciting. But what I often say is we're at this crossroads with dads where we could like get really scared and go back to the 1950 model and go, oh yeah, no, it's too scary because we have to change too much. Or we could be really brave and we could go, forward, basically. And I think we will go forward, but it's just dragging the people who are dragging their feet along with us.
Okay. Thank you, Kathy. There's a couple more questions. We've only got a couple more minutes. I imagine that some people will be popping off. I think if you already have, by 11 o'clock. I'm not sure what your plans are, Anna, but if you have to leave, Kathy and I are more than happy to hang around and maybe speak to the people who still got questions. But very quickly, Christian Engels has a question. He's an expecting dad, and he has a question about the fact that you've mentioned the 5 dimensions of dad attachment: patience, tolerance, interaction, pride, and affection. Are there any particular ways to foster these? Baby massage was an example that Christian's given.
Okay. Do you know what's really important? If he's an expectant dad, is starting that work right now. So we talk very little about prenatal attachment in men because they're not going through that, they're not physically close in the same way a woman is. But the increasing evidence we have now is that prenatal attachment in men to their children is really important. So what I would say to him is start now. And it is that slightly awkward thing of talking to the bump and reading to the bump and singing to the bump and all those sorts of things. But the other thing is we know that dads who take the time to use their imagination and daydream about their future with their baby, who's their baby going to be? What kind of a dad do they want to be? What are they going to do together? All those sorts of things. We know that dads do that, who start to imagine that baby, have really strong prenatal attachment, but that's predictive of postnatal attachment as well. So if you take the time during pregnancy to start the work now, that attachment is much more powerful when born. And I have a lovely, and it's only an anecdote, but one of my dads who I studied once, he used to sing Twinkle Twinkle Little Star to the bump every night. And then when the baby was born and was on mum's chest, he sang Twinkle Twinkle Little Star and the baby reacted to him. Now, I think that shows you that this baby is building a relationship with you, even though they're not physically that close to you.
Yeah, fantastic. Another anecdote that I share when we do our training is prior to COVID, there was a health visitor, and as this was happening in a few places, going into Perth prison where there were some men inside who had someone on the outside who was pregnant, and they were getting these guys to read the Gruffalo.
Oh, lovely.
The mobile phone, and then taking the mobile phone back to the mum to be and getting the mum to, relax, play the dad who's in prison, reading the story. And that's a really powerful example of how, even under the most difficult and extreme circumstances, we can create that bond between
absolutely
the unborn baby. So yeah, fantastic. And Pete, you've got your hand up as well.
Yeah. Hi. Good morning, everybody.
Hello.
Hello, Anna. I just wanted to say thank you so much for that talk. It was very comforting and validating on so many points. Basically, just a couple of things. It's kind of made me feel very happy about the way I parented from the beginning. I've got a boy who's almost 6, and I've always championed the importance of like the dad's role and my role in his life. I now work with NCT parent support, particularly around new dads who are struggling with their mental health. A lot of it to do with how useful they are and their bonding and that kind of. Just to say thank you for the information you've given me, because it's such a wealth of knowledge and information that I can go back to them with and I can use in my dealings with new dads. And also to the other people who are in the room that are running some incredible organisations that I can hopefully connect with as well. So it's just to say that. And
well, that's really kind. Thank you.
I'm definitely going to get your book and invest in that.
Lovely. Thanks. I just want to say the fact that you've shown your son that way of fathering, that will cross the generation now. He is basically the thing that is going to change the culture.
Yeah, and that was it. That we are the change. You said, it could take a couple of generations, but we are the beginning.
Yeah, you are. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Pete. So I don't think we have any more questions. The room is rapidly shrinking as everyone goes off to do whatever it is they're doing on our, goodness me, I forgot what day of the week it is.
Thursday.
Thursday. Pre-Christmas madness.
Yes.
So just one final thing to ask for those that are here, if you don't mind, if you have the time, clicking on the link that Kathy's just shared there in the chat box. That'll just really help us understand what you've really gotten from a session like this, and what other things you might want to hear about in the future. We can invite anybody along that you think would help you in your role as a dad, or as part of an organisation, whatever it happens to be. If you're interested in facilitating one of these DADx sessions yourself, let us know. We're pleased to kind of support anybody who wants to share what they're doing and what they're thinking, what their plans are. So listen, we were due to finish at 11 o'clock. It's 3 minutes past 11. Can I just finish off then by first of all thanking you, Dr. Anna Machin. I pronounced your name wrong.
Don't worry, you pronounced it the really nice Scottish way.
Well, I did. Machin. Yeah. Well,
yeah. If I come up there, I get it. It's pronounced that way, so that's fine.
Well, as somebody who gets my name pronounced wrong every single day of my life, I should know, you know. But so thanks for having me along. It's been a really fascinating hour. Clearly a lot of interest, and I think people have found the work that you've done and the messages that you're putting out there really inspiring and motivational. And as I said, I think from a lot of the dads that are here today, it's really validating for them and who they are and who they want to be. So thanks so much, Anna. That's been fantastic.